You know, Hollywood just loves the idea of the criminal mastermind, right? The genius pulling all the strings from the shadows. But the real world job of catching a serial killer, well, it's a whole lot more methodical and way more psychologically complex. So today, we're going to peel back that fiction and see how actual FBI profilers get inside a killer's head using a process that's just as much an art as it is a science. And this quote right here, it just shatters that whole myth of the sophisticated monster. See, forensic psychologists will tell you the reality is often kind of pathetic. We are not talking about some brilliant strategist here. We're talking about a person with the emotional maturity of a toddler who's totally fixated on their own needs and is basically driven by a tantrum they can't control. And that immaturity, that is the absolute bedrock of their entire psychology. So to understand that immature mind, profilers have to make this one crucial distinction. On one side, you've got the modus operandi, the MO. That's the how. You know, the weapon they use, the location, the specific method. The MO is practical, and it can change. A killer might get better at it, or maybe they just have to adapt on the fly. But the other side, that's the signature, and that's the why. The signature is that unchanging ritual that gives the killer their emotional fulfillment. If they don't get to perform their signature, the murder just isn't satisfying for them. And that is the key that unlocks their deepest psychological needs. All right, so let's get into the killer's code. We're going to take a look at the core psychological ideas that profilers use to decode that signature, to really get at the why behind all the violence. You know, most of us think that killers are driven by this explosive, out-of-control rage. But the most dangerous ones, they operate with something far, far colder: predatory aggression. This is not a crime of passion. It is a calm, purposeful hunt. Think of it like a carnivore stalking its prey. The killer isn't feeling anger. They're just satisfying a deep, dark need. And that mindset is what allows them to see other people as just objects, making it chillingly easy for them to prey on them. And right here is the engine that drives that predatory behavior: psychopathic narcissism. Remember that immature, raging child we talked about? Well, they are stuck in what Freud called the id phase. They're driven completely by the pleasure principle, that need for immediate gratification. In their minds, the world is a movie that exists only for their benefit. And tragically, their victims are just disposable extras in their personal drama. They feel totally entitled to take whatever they want with zero regard for anyone else. So, how in the world does an investigator take these big psychological ideas and actually apply them to a chaotic crime scene? Well, that's where legendary FBI profiler Johnny Douglas comes in. He's the guy who inspired the show Mindhunter, and he pioneered this structured playbook to basically reverse engineer a killer's mind. His 7-step process is really a masterclass in deduction. It all starts with evaluating the criminal act itself: the what, the where, the how. Then he dives deep into the crime scene, looking for physical clues, and into the victim's profile for insights. Every single layer, from police reports to the coroner's autopsy, adds another piece to this giant puzzle. And only after absorbing all of that data does he finally build a profile, and then suggest a concrete strategy to catch the guy. Now, theory is one thing, but let's see how this method actually works in the real world. We're going to look at a baffling, week-long murder spree that had local police completely, and I mean completely, stumped, until John Douglas got the call. Okay, so picture this. It's 1981, and a string of brutal murders is terrorizing Illinois and Wisconsin. It starts with 2 black men killed in a grocery store. The very next day, a white gas station cashier is murdered. Then another. Then 2 more victims at a Radio Shack. The spree was crossing state lines. The killer used different weapons, and the victims seemed to have absolutely nothing in common. It was chaos. Now here's why investigators were so confused. The crimes look like robberies, but almost nothing of value was ever taken. The violence was just extreme, total overkill, which suggests rage, but the killer was also very methodical. And while most serial killers tend to stick to their own race, this one was crossing racial lines. There was no logical motive. And that's the key. The motive wasn't logical. It was psychological. So using his method, Douglas built this just astonishingly precise profile. He figured the killer was from Rockford, since the spree started there and kind of radiated outward. The excessive violence, that overkill, pointed to a deeply paranoid personality. The use of a car and the timing of the crimes suggested he had a menial job. Douglas even predicted he'd own a large power dog and drive a big car, classic overcompensations for feeling inadequate. And this profile, it led investigators directly to Raymond Lee Stewart, who fit it almost perfectly.
You see, catching a killer isn't just about analyzing blood spatter and fibers. It often becomes this high-stakes chess match, a battle of psychological warfare, where both sides are using deception as a weapon.
On one side of the board, you've got the killers, who are absolute masters of faking empathy. They pretend to show love and concern just to control everyone around them, twisting reality so that their own family and friends never suspect the monster hiding underneath. Then, on the other side, you've got the profilers, and they're playing mind games too. They come up with strategies to crank up a suspect's guilt and paranoia, rattling their cage until they make a mistake, or even turn themselves in.
And this case is a perfect example of that kind of creative strategy. In the murder of Deliana Hang, police were pretty sure they had their guy, a bodybuilder, but they couldn't get a warrant for his DNA. So what did they do? They sent an undercover ex-cop, who also happened to be a weightlifter, to befriend him at his gym. The officer told the suspect he had a secret nutritionist who could create the perfect health plan, but he'd need a blood sample. The suspect's narcissism just took over. He eagerly agreed, and just like that, his fate was sealed, and a future killer was stopped cold.
So what about that old cliche we've all heard? The killer always returns to the scene of the crime. Well, it turns out there's a lot of truth to it, but the reasons why they come back are incredibly revealing.
Profilers have found there are basically two main things that drive this behavior. First, you have the remorseful killer. They might go back to a grave or a dump site because they're just overwhelmed with guilt, looking for some kind of forgiveness. But then you have the sadistic killer. They return for a totally different reason: to fantasize, to relive the power and the control they felt during the murder. I mean, Ted Bundy famously went back to the decomposing bodies of his victims, a chilling example of someone returning not for repentance but for pleasure.
The methods we've looked at are incredibly effective, there's no doubt about it, but they come at a heavy cost. Profilers like John Douglas, they have to step into the most warped, twisted minds imaginable. In fact, Douglas himself nearly died when the immense stress of his job caused his immune system to completely collapse. This work saves lives, but it forces us to ask one final, haunting question. To catch these monsters, you have to understand them. But what part of yourself do you risk losing in that darkness?